Picture this. You're walking through an ancient temple, torches flickering against stone walls covered in mysterious symbols. The air is thick with incense, and in the distance, you hear chanting. You think you're witnessing something sacred, something beautiful from our ancestors. But then you look closer, and what you see makes your blood run cold. Because throughout human history, some of the most revered traditions weren't just strange or unusual. They were absolutely horrifying. Today, we're diving into 10 ancient practices that will make you grateful you live in the modern world. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at history the same way again. Let's start with something that sounds almost poetic until you understand what it really meant. Sati, the ancient Indian practice of widow burning. When a high-caste Hindu man died, his widow was expected, sometimes forced, to throw herself onto his funeral pyre and burn alive alongside his corpse. Imagine being a woman in ancient India, grieving the loss of your husband, only to be told that your life must end too. The practice was justified through religious texts and social pressure, with the belief that a devoted wife should follow her husband into death. Women who went through with it were honored as saintly, while those who refused faced social ostracization, their heads shaved, forced to wear white, treated as outcasts. Some women chose it willingly, indoctrinated into believing it was their sacred duty. Others were drugged, tied down, or pushed into the flames by family members eager to claim the inheritance without having to support a widow. The screams of these women were drowned out by drums and chanting. The British colonial administration finally banned it in 1829, but isolated cases continued well into the 20th century. This wasn't just some rare occurrence. Thousands upon thousands of women died this way over centuries. Now let's travel to ancient China and talk about foot binding, a practice that lasted for over 1,000 years. Starting when girls were as young as 4 or 5 years old, their feet would be deliberately broken and bound tightly with cloth to prevent growth. The goal? To achieve tiny 3-inch feet, called lotus feet, considered the ultimate standard of beauty and marriageability. The process was excruciating. Mothers would soak their daughters' feet in hot water mixed with herbs and animal blood, then bend the toes underneath the foot and wrap them so tightly that the bones would break and reshape. The arch would be forced into an extreme curve, essentially folding the foot in half. Girls would scream and cry, barely able to walk for years. Many developed infections, gangrene, and lost toes or even entire feet to necrosis. But this torture was seen as necessary. A woman with natural feet was considered unmarriageable, destined for poverty and shame. These women wobbled on their broken feet their entire lives, dependent on others, unable to run or even walk normally. The practice wasn't fully eliminated until the communist revolution in the mid-20th century, but by then, it had crippled millions of women across centuries. Let's cross the ocean to Mesoamerica, where the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. We're not talking about occasional ritual killings, we're talking about industrial-scale slaughter. The Aztecs believed the sun god Huitzilopochtli needed human blood to rise each day, and without it, the world would end in darkness. So they fed him. During the dedication of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in 1487, historians estimate that between 20,000 and 80,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Picture lines of prisoners stretching for miles, waiting their turn to climb the pyramid steps. At the top, priests would pin them down on a stone altar, slice open their chests with obsidian blades, and rip out their still-beating hearts, holding them up to the sun before tossing the bodies down the pyramid steps. The skulls were placed on massive racks called tzompantli, walls of death that numbered in the tens of thousands. Spanish conquistadors described seeing these skull racks and being utterly horrified, which is saying something considering the brutality of the Inquisition they brought with them. Young warriors, children, and slaves were all sacrificed. Some captives were treated like gods for weeks before being killed, fattened up and honored, which somehow makes it even more disturbing. Now, let's talk about the ancient Spartans and what they did to their own children in the name of creating the perfect warrior society. Sparta's agoge training system was legendary, but what's less often discussed is the inspection of newborn babies by elders. If an infant appeared weak, sickly, or deformed in any way, it would be taken to a chasm on Mount Tagetes called the Apothete and thrown off the cliff to die. That's right. They murdered their own babies for not meeting physical standards. Boys who survived infancy were taken from their families at age 7 and subjected to brutal military training designed to break them and rebuild them as fearless soldiers. They were deliberately underfed to encourage stealing, but if caught stealing, they were severely whipped, not for the theft, but for being caught. They slept on beds of reeds they had to gather themselves, trained barefoot in all weather, and were subjected to a ritual called the diamastigosis, where teenage boys were whipped in front of an altar, sometimes to death, to prove their endurance. The Spartans also conducted annual war on the Helots, enslaved people, where young Spartan men would hunt and murder Helots in the dark as practice, a ritual called the Krypteia. This state-sanctioned murder spree kept the enslaved population terrified, and gave teenage boys experience in killing. This wasn't just tough love, this was systematic brutalization. Let's move to ancient Rome and discuss a practice that entertained millions: gladiatorial combat. While Hollywood has romanticized these blood sports, the reality was far darker. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals who had no choice but to fight and die for the entertainment of screaming crowds. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators who would watch men hack each other to pieces with swords, tridents, and nets. Some fights were to the death automatically. In others, the losing gladiator's fate was decided by the crowd's thumbs, and they usually wanted blood. Between gladiator fights, the Romans would flood the arena and stage naval battles, or release wild animals to maul condemned prisoners who were sometimes tied to posts or dressed in animal skins. Thousands of exotic animals, lions, bears, elephants, crocodiles, were slaughtered in single-day spectacles. During the Colosseum's inauguration, 9,000 animals were killed over 100 days of games. Some prisoners were even subjected to fatal charades, where they would reenact myths in ways that guaranteed their death, being burned alive like Hercules, or torn apart by animals like Orpheus. The crowd would eat snacks and cheer while watching real human beings torn limb from limb. This went on for centuries, now to something that affected millions: Viking blood eagle executions. While there's historical debate about whether this was actually practiced or merely a poetic description, medieval sources describe a ritual execution so horrifying it's burned into history. The victim would be placed face down, and the executioner would cut the ribs from the spine with an axe, spreading them outward to resemble an eagle's wings. Then they'd pull out the lungs through the opening, leaving them to flutter with the victim's final breaths like wings. This was supposedly reserved for the worst enemies and traitors, turning execution into grotesque art. Whether it happened exactly this way or not, it reveals the Viking capacity for creative brutality. More confirmed is their practice of blood sacrifice. Archaeological evidence shows humans and animals were hung in sacred groves as offerings to Odin, left to rot among the trees. At the temple at Uppsala in Sweden, every 9 years, a festival would see 9 males of every species, including humans, sacrificed and hung in a sacred grove. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing dozens of decomposing bodies swaying in the wind. Let's discuss the Maya and their bloodletting rituals, which took self-sacrifice to disturbing extremes. Maya royalty would pierce their own bodies, tongues, earlobes, genitals, with stingray spines, obsidian blades, or thorny ropes to offer their blood to the gods. Queens would draw thorned ropes through their tongues, while kings would pierce their penises, collecting the blood on bark paper that would then be burned, the smoke carrying their offering to the heavens. This wasn't done once. It was a regular religious obligation. The pain was considered spiritually purifying, and the hallucinogenic state induced by blood loss was seen as a way to communicate with the divine. Captives weren't spared either. In some ceremonies, victims would be painted blue, taken to the top of pyramids, and have their hearts removed while still alive. Sometimes they'd be thrown into sacred cenotes, deep natural wells, as sacrifices to the rain god Chak. Archaeologists have found the remains of hundreds of people, including children, at the bottom of these wells, tossed in to drown or die from the fall. Ancient Egypt, for all its grandeur, had a dark practice called retainer sacrifice. When a pharaoh died during the first dynasty, servants, guards, and even courtiers would be killed and buried with them to serve in the afterlife. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people would be executed, or even buried alive in chambers surrounding the royal tomb. Imagine being a loyal servant, only to learn that your reward for service is being murdered, so you can continue serving your master in death. Later dynasties moved to burying Shabti dolls, small figurines that would magically come to life to serve the dead. But for centuries, real people were sacrificed. Evidence also shows that workers who built secret tomb chambers were sometimes sealed inside or killed to protect the location of treasure. These workers spent years of backbreaking labor only to be murdered to keep a secret. Now let's talk about the Celts and their wicker man sacrifices, described by Julius Caesar and other Roman sources. The Celts would construct enormous human-shaped figures from wicker and wood, fill them with live prisoners, criminals, or even volunteers who believed they'd earn favor with the gods, then set the whole structure on fire. Imagine being trapped inside a giant burning effigy, the wicker cage preventing escape, the screams of dozens of others mixing with your own as the flames consumed you all. The Celts also practiced bog sacrifices, rituals where people were strangled, stabbed, or had their throats cut before being deposited in peat bogs. The oxygen-free, acidic environment of these bogs preserved the bodies remarkably well, and modern archaeology has uncovered hundreds of these bog bodies, some showing signs of elaborate ritual killing. Many had been tortured or killed in multiple ways, the triple death of hanging, stabbing, and drowning, suggesting these weren't mere executions but ceremonial offerings to multiple gods. Finally, let's end with the Phoenician and Carthaginian practice of child sacrifice to the god Moloch, one of the most controversial and horrifying traditions in ancient history. Despite attempts by some historians to reinterpret the evidence, archaeological sites like the Tophet of Carthage contain thousands of urns filled with the charred bones of infants and young children. Ancient sources describe bronze statues of Moloch with outstretched arms, heated red hot, where babies would be placed and rolled into a fire pit while drums and flutes drowned out their screams. Families would sacrifice their own children during times of crisis, believing it would appease the gods and bring favor. The wealthiest families were expected to sacrifice their firstborn sons. Some historians argue these were stillborn babies, or children who died naturally, but the evidence increasingly suggests deliberate sacrifice. The sheer scale is staggering: tens of thousands of children over centuries, burned alive in the name of divine favor. So, there you have it, 10 ancient traditions that make modern life look pretty good by comparison. From widows burned alive to children sacrificed to gods, from feet deliberately broken to hearts ripped from living chests, our ancestors practiced horrors in the name of religion, honor, and tradition. These weren't the acts of monsters. They were normal people who believed these practices were not just acceptable, but necessary, even sacred. It makes you wonder, what are we doing today that future generations will look back on with the same horror? Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's a nightmare we should be grateful we woke up from.